One door, one widow, 100 secrets no one dares open. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Comment where you're watching from. Seeing this community grow is my favorite part. Let's step inside, if you dare. It was on a pale, rain-hushed Thursday afternoon in the village of Brambleford that the matter of room 17 came to light. The old Brambleford Inn, a squat building of soot-stained stone, had been quietly busy with the usual handful of traveling salesmen and weekend visitors when the most unlikely disturbance unfolded. Mr. Trelawney, the innkeeper, a man more concerned with the dryness of his cellars than the comings and goings of his guests, had been summoned upstairs by a chambermaid whose face was the color of unbaked dough. She could scarcely form the words, stammering something about the widow in room 17. He followed her, each creaking step on the narrow staircase seeming to echo in the stale hallway. When he reached the door, there was nothing but silence on the other side. A knock yielded no answer. A second knock, louder, was equally futile. With some reluctance, he fetched the passkey. The door swung open without resistance. The widow was there, seated in the armchair by the narrow window. At first glance, she might have been sleeping. Her black dress, always modest, was perfectly arranged, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, but her head lolled at an unnatural angle, and her face bore that peculiar stillness which was unmistakable. Mrs. Agnes Collingford, the silent, self-contained widow who had checked in 4 days prior, was quite dead. The scene was oddly serene, almost staged. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no marks upon her. On the little side table sat a teacup, still half full, its rim faintly stained with rouge from her lipstick. Next to it lay a single scrap of paper, no longer than an inch across, with nothing upon it but a neatly drawn spiral in blue ink. It seemed absurd, almost childlike. There was no pen in the room. Dr. Llewellyn, summoned from the village, examined her swiftly. His conclusion, voiced with some hesitation, was that she had likely died from a sudden heart failure. And yet there was a furrow in his brow as he said it, a glance toward the teacup as though it troubled him. He offered to take the cup for further testing, though he muttered it was likely nothing at all. The police were duly called. Sergeant Finch, a tidy but unimaginative man, inspected the room with all the caution of someone hoping to find nothing complicated. The windows were latched from the inside. The door locked from within before Trelawney had opened it. The key was still in the lock on the inside. No footprints in the carpet suggested an intruder. Finch looked at the spiral on the scrap of paper with mild irritation, dropped it into an envelope, and declared that the woman had died of natural causes. Case closed. But Brambleford was the sort of place where death, in an inn, was never entirely a private matter. News traveled quickly. By the evening, the widow's passing was the subject of quiet discussion at the tea shop, the grocer's, and inevitably at the vicarage, where Miss Jane Marple was knitting by the window. She listened with polite interest to Mrs. Weatherby's recounting of the event, noting each detail with the delicate precision of one who had lived long enough to know that people seldom tell a story without altering it, however unconsciously. A teacup, a locked door, a scrap of paper with a spiral, these things were recited, perhaps not in their proper order, but with enough consistency to pique her mind. Miss Marple did not hurry to the inn. She had learned over many years that arriving too soon at the scene of a death made people wary. It was better to appear coincidentally, as though one had wandered in by chance. The following morning, she took it upon herself to deliver a small basket of scones to Mr. Trelawney, remarking, quite truthfully, that an inn must be under terrible strain when such unfortunate incidents occur. Trelawney, flattered by the gesture and still unsettled by the whole affair, welcomed her in. It was then she saw the room. Finch had left it tidy, the bed stripped, the air faintly scented with polish. But Miss Marple's eyes were not easily misled by neatness. She noticed the chair by the window was a little too squarely aligned, as though someone had straightened it after use. She noticed the faint mark on the wooden sill where something had once rested. A vase, perhaps. But there was no vase in sight, and she noticed, too, the absence of any writing materials in the room, despite the widow's apparent fondness for correspondence in the lounge earlier that week. The spiral intrigued her. People did not draw such shapes idly, especially not on scraps of paper so small and deliberate. She had seen spirals like that before, in a child's puzzle book, in shorthand annotations, and once in a case involving a rather unscrupulous traveling hypnotist. It was, she reflected, a curious choice for a dying woman to have before her. Miss Marple's gentle questions around the inn uncovered more peculiarities. Mrs. Collingford had kept almost entirely to herself, except for 2 interactions, one with the postman to whom she had sent a letter the day before her death, and one with a well-dressed man who had called at the inn on Tuesday evening. Trelawney described the man vaguely. Dark coat, hat pulled low, a face that did not invite memory. He had not signed the guest book. He had asked for Mrs. Collingford by name. They had spoken privately in the lounge for perhaps 20 minutes. After that, the widow appeared paler than usual, though she said nothing of the encounter. The police had not considered this man worth pursuing. Finch reasoned that visitors came and went in such places without significance. But Miss Marple could not help thinking of the timing. Visitor, a letter, a sudden death. She thought, too, of the scrap of paper. If Mrs. Collingford had been aware of some danger enough to leave a sign, it might not be a random sketch at all. Her mind returned to a case she had once read about in a local gazette, where a spiral was used as a code between 2 conspirators to mark the presence of a concealed document. It was simple enough to miss, but precise enough to be recognized by the intended party. And if such a code had been drawn in room 17, the question was not merely who it was meant for, but whether it had already been seen by them. Miss Marple did not yet voice her suspicions, but as she left the inn, she paused to glance back at the narrow upper windows. Room 17 sat quietly above, its curtains drawn. A locked room, a teacup, a scrap of paper. The whole thing was curiously tidy. Too tidy, she thought, and in her experience, tidy things had a way of hiding rather messy truths. Miss Marple's return to the vicarage was not a retreat, but rather the deliberate step of one who knew that a mystery must be approached as one approaches a tangled skein, patiently, with no jerking at knots. She spent the evening in her usual quiet way, knitting steadily as her thoughts wound and unwound around the peculiar image of the spiral and the stranger's visit. It was not, she felt, a matter to be pushed too quickly. People reveal themselves more freely when they believe no one is prying. By the following morning, Sergeant Finch was making his rounds at the inn again. It seemed the post office had delivered a telegram addressed to Mrs. Collingford even after her death, likely posted before news had spread. Finch had opened it in the presence of Mr. Trelawney, but its contents were frustratingly plain. Letter received. Matter proceeding as arranged. No signature. Finch shrugged it off, chalking it up to private business that would forever remain private. To Miss Marple, however, the phrasing had the faintest whiff of arrangement, of a business that might not have been so innocent. She happened to arrive at the inn just as Finch was leaving. He greeted her politely, perhaps with a trace of relief. Miss Marple's quiet observations had a way of soothing the villagers, which was often more than he could manage. "Nothing more to see here, I think, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "Doctor says it was the heart. That teacup will be looked at, of course, but I don't expect much." "Oh, how comforting," she said mildly, her eyes just glancing past him toward the inn's dim hallway. "Still, I do find it interesting, Sergeant, how very tidy room 17 remains. I always think grief and disorder seem to go together somehow. But here, it all seems as though nothing had happened at all." Finch, who disliked being drawn into speculation, muttered something about innkeepers being tidy by nature and took his leave. Miss Marple entered, ostensibly to visit Mrs. Trelawney in the kitchen, with a jar of homemade marmalade. She chatted amiably, asking after the guests, and learned that Mrs. Collingford had been in the habit of taking her tea in the lounge, where she often sat by the fire in the evenings. A curious fact emerged. On the night before her death, she had left her tea untouched. The maid, assuming it had cooled, had taken it away. The next morning, however, in her room, the teacup was half drunk. It was a tiny detail, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple stored it carefully. People who neglect tea in the evening seldom drink it enthusiastically in the morning, unless there is something different about the circumstance. She ascended to room 17 again, this time under the guise of inquiring about the maid's burden in preparing it for the next guest. The room remained just as polished as before, yet it yielded more to a careful eye. She noticed a faint ring on the mantelpiece where a small vase or jar had once been set. She also noted the position of the teacup on the table, close to the armchair's right arm. Mrs. Collingford had been left-handed, or at least she wrote with her left hand in the lounge earlier that week. A left-handed person's teacup seldom rests so far to the right, unless it has been placed there by another. The small scrap of paper, too, returned to her mind. Finch had taken it away, of course, but she recalled that it was cleanly cut on two sides and ragged on the other, torn from a larger sheet. The spiral was drawn in blue ink, a color she had not seen among Mrs. Collingford's few visible possessions. A peculiar thing, for a solitary widow to leave such a mark behind when she had no visible correspondence at hand. Descending again, she passed a tall man in the hallway, a Mr. Hargreaves, a commercial traveler who had taken room 14. He greeted her politely enough, but there was a faint stiffness to his manner. Miss Marple thought nothing of it until Mrs. Trelawney mentioned, with the casual candor of an innkeeper's wife, that Mr. Hargreaves had extended his stay by another day, owing to some papers he needed to put in order. Papers, Miss Marple thought, were curious things to arrange in a village inn, especially when one had been in such a hurry to leave the day before. Later that afternoon, she found an excuse to linger in the lounge, knitting serenely by the fire. It was there she saw Mr. Hargreaves again, speaking to the maid in an almost over-courteous tone. The girl seemed flustered. When he left, Miss Marple inquired gently whether the gentleman had required anything special. The maid hesitated before admitting that he had asked whether Mrs. Collingford had left behind any writing materials, particularly a blue ink pen. She had told him there was nothing of the sort. That tiny request stirred the threads of Miss Marple's thoughts into a tighter pattern. A man who inquires about a pen of a specific color, in a room where a widow has left a cryptic spiral in that same color. Why, that is rarely coincidence. Yet his manner was too polished for open alarm. He was fishing, but for what? The day drew in grey and damp, the rain tracing patterns on the inn's windows. Miss Marple remained by the fire, seemingly absorbed in her knitting, but her mind was quietly arranging the scene in room 17 again and again. The left-handed widow, the teacup on the right, the missing vase, the scrap of paper, the stranger's visit. One item continued to trouble her more than the rest: the vase. For if a vase had been on the sill and was now absent, it meant someone had moved it. And why move a vase at all, unless it contained or concealed something worth moving for? As the clock struck 5, Mr. Trelawney emerged from his office to announce that another guest had just telephoned to cancel. Room 17 would remain unlet for a few more days. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but inside she felt the smallest thrill of opportunity. Sometimes it was a gift to have a room remain just as it was, even after official matters were closed. That evening, as the lamps glowed low, she asked Mr. Trelawney, ever amenable to the kindness of a respectful elderly lady, if she might step into room 17 just to see the arrangement of furniture. It's such a pleasant layout. He obliged, thinking nothing of it. Alone, she moved quietly, her eyes searching every surface. It was then, stooping to adjust her shawl, that she saw a small trace on the carpet near the sill, a faint glint of something metallic caught between the fibers. A pin. Not a sewing pin, but a narrow clasp pin of the sort used to fasten a folded paper, its edge faintly smudged with blue. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind making its quiet calculations. Someone had been careless or hurried. A pin used to secure a document, a missing vase that might have hidden it, a spiral that might indicate where or to whom it should go. Mrs. Collingford had not been merely a solitary widow taking tea in a quiet village, and someone, very likely still in Brambleford, had not found what they were looking for. Her gaze shifted toward the closed door, the hall beyond where Mr. Hargreaves had passed not an hour before. Miss Marple's expression remained as serene as ever, but behind her clear blue eyes, a web was beginning to form. Miss Marple had always said that in a small village, or a small inn, the truth was never quite what it appeared at first glance. People spoke in ways that reflected their own concerns, and if one listened carefully, contradictions surfaced like stones in a stream. The morning after her quiet discovery of the pin, she arranged to be in the lounge when the guests began to stir. Her knitting needles clicked softly, her gaze lowered, the very picture of harmless occupation. But her ears were sharp. Mr. Hargreaves was the first to drift in. He greeted her courteously, as before, but she noted a faint trace of impatience in his voice when he ordered coffee rather than tea. Miss Marple remarked lightly on the poor weather and the inconvenience it must cause to a man whose work took him on the road. "Oh, I don't mind another day here," he said too quickly, glancing toward the hallway that led to the rooms. "Comfortable enough for paperwork." "Paperwork is such a bore, isn't it?" Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "I'm afraid I always put it off until the last possible moment. You must be very diligent, Mr. Hargreaves." He smiled faintly, though his eyes narrowed just enough for her to see he disliked the line of conversation. "One must be, in business." It was a bland remark, but it struck Miss Marple that he had not yet mentioned Mrs. Collingford's death at all. Most guests spoke of it, if only to express polite regret. His omission was as telling as his words. Shortly after he left, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Redford, a cheerful matron who had occupied room 12. Mrs. Redford was eager to talk about the tragedy. Too eager, Miss Marple thought. She launched into her version of events with dramatic sympathy, recalling how she had passed Mrs. Collingford in the corridor on Wednesday morning. "She looked perfectly fine then, dear," Mrs. Redford insisted. "Even nodded to me, though come to think of it, she did seem a bit distracted. Kept glancing over her shoulder as if she thought someone might be following her." "A nervous woman, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Oh no, I shouldn't say nervous. More like wary. And she was carrying a little envelope. I remember because it slipped from her glove and she snatched it up very quickly before I could help her. Private business, I expect." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very observant of you, Mrs. Redford. And was that before or after the gentleman caller arrived on Tuesday evening?" Mrs. Redford's brow furrowed. "Tuesday evening? Oh no, I'm sure that was Wednesday afternoon. I saw him myself. Dark coat, hat brim pulled low. He asked for her at the desk." That was curious. Mr. Trelawney had been quite firm about the man arriving Tuesday. Yet Mrs. Redford was equally firm it had been Wednesday. Either one of them was mistaken, or someone wanted the timing to appear different. Miss Marple let it rest, merely thanking Mrs. Redford for her kindness. She then sought out young Sarah, the chambermaid, whose nervous glances had not escaped her notice. Sarah hesitated before speaking, wringing her hands in her apron. "I don't like to talk about guests, miss, but you've always been so kind. The police didn't ask much, but I thought it strange. The morning she died, Mrs. Collingford's window was open just a crack. It hadn't been the night before. I'd shut it myself when I turned down the bed." "Indeed. And was anything different in the room?" Sarah shook her head, but her eyes dropped to her apron. "Only The vase was gone. There was always a little vase on the sill. I thought maybe she'd put it away herself. Miss Marple patted her hand. People do sometimes tidy their own rooms unexpectedly, my dear. It's nothing to trouble yourself over. But inwardly, she noted the confirmation. The vase's disappearance was not her imagination. Before long, Mr. Trelawney appeared, bustling with the self-importance of a man who feels a shadow of suspicion upon his establishment. He repeated his account almost word for word as he had told the police, but Miss Marple noticed that when she asked casually about the gentleman caller, he hesitated. Well, yes, he came Tuesday evening. Asked for Mrs. Collingford. Stayed perhaps 20 minutes, but he left by the back door. Said he didn't wish to disturb the other guests. That was considerate of him, Miss Marple said mildly. Yes, considerate, Mr. Trelawney echoed, though he did not meet her eyes. Her last conversation of the day was with Mrs. Trelawney, who was always a more reliable source of detail. In her quiet, practical way, she admitted that she had overheard part of the conversation between Mrs. Collingford and her caller through the half-open lounge door. They were talking about something being ready, Mrs. Trelawney said. The man said he would return for it later, but she told him it might be safer to send it by post. He sounded not angry exactly, but firm, and she sounded worried. Miss Marple thanked her and returned to her knitting in the lounge. Each conversation had added a thread. A gentleman caller whose day of arrival was disputed. A left-handed woman with her teacup placed to the right. A missing vase. An envelope guarded closely. A telegram speaking of arrangements. A man still lingering at the inn without clear reason. Contradictions were beginning to emerge. Small ones, but enough to suggest that at least one witness was shaping their story. And in Miss Marple's experience, when people altered details, it was rarely out of politeness. It was to hide something. Her needles clicked softly as she watched Mr. Hargreaves step out into the drizzle for a walk that took him not into the village, but toward the post office. Meanwhile, Mrs. Redford sat by the fire, telling yet another version of her sighting of Mrs. Collingford, the details shifting ever so slightly each time. Miss Marple's lips curved in the faintest smile. Voices, she knew, could be as deceptive as appearances, but they often gave themselves away, if one only listened long enough. Miss Marple's mind was never at rest when a puzzle's pieces did not fit neatly. In Brambleford's little inn, each person now appeared to have some reason, some thread, linking them to Mrs. Collingford's quiet, sudden death. But none of the threads yet formed a full pattern. That evening, as the rain continued to patter softly against the windows, Miss Marple sat in the lounge with her knitting in her lap, letting her thoughts run like a ledger of possibilities. Mr. Hargreaves, the commercial traveller, was the most obvious anomaly. He had extended his stay under the pretext of paperwork, yet no one had seen more than a small attaché case in his possession. His questions about a blue ink pen were far too specific, and his casual manner masked an undercurrent of watchfulness. Greed, perhaps? A document worth obtaining? If Mrs. Collingford had something valuable, financial papers, or something that might be sold, then Hargreaves might have had cause to want it. Mrs. Redford's role was more subtle. She had been eager, too eager, to talk. Her story about Mrs. Collingford carrying an envelope hinted at knowledge of something secret, yet her memory of the visitor's timing shifted each time she told it. A misremembering or an attempt to place the mysterious caller at a more convenient hour. Could jealousy be involved? Mrs. Redford's late husband had been in the shipping trade, and there were whispers she had been left with debts. If Mrs. Collingford had ties to the same circles, perhaps there had been an old grievance. Then there were the Trelawneys. Mr. Trelawney's account of the caller was careful, almost rehearsed, yet his eagerness to move past the incident suggested unease. Mrs. Trelawney's overheard conversation, the caller discussing it being ready, implied the inn had been the setting for more than casual tea drinking. Fear, Miss Marple thought, could explain much in the Trelawney's case. An innkeeper cannot afford scandal. A whiff of illegal dealings could ruin them, and Mrs. Collingford herself, the silent widow, had been clearly involved in something secretive. A stranger arriving discreetly, a telegram about arrangements, a spiral drawn in blue ink, and a missing vase that might have hidden papers. She had been waiting for something or someone. If she feared betrayal, she might have taken precautions, though evidently not enough. The puzzle was complicated further by the fact that each of these threads intersected only loosely. Hargreaves and Mrs. Redford had no obvious connection, yet both seemed concerned with Mrs. Collingford's possessions. The Trelawneys had no reason to involve themselves in her personal affairs, unless the contents of room 17 somehow affected the inn directly. Miss Marple's habit was to turn such problems over in the mind as one turns over a piece of knitting, inspecting the reverse. Sometimes the wrong side revealed the true pattern. The next morning she decided to sort through alibis. A casual walk to the post office gave her the perfect excuse to greet the postmistress, Mrs. Pratt, who always had an air for comings and goings. "Such a pity about Mrs. Collingford," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Pratt leaned forward confidentially. "Strange business. I don't like to speak ill of the dead, but she did send rather a lot of letters these past weeks. Registered post, too. Said they were to London, but the handwriting on the return, envelopes. Well, some looked foreign to me. Foreign handwriting, registered letters, and a stranger's visit." Miss Marple filed that away. "And I suppose Mr. Hargreaves has been in for his correspondence?" "Twice, dear, and always with a look as though he expected something that wasn't there." Back at the inn, Miss Marple found Mrs. Redford cheerfully recounting her version of events once more, this time to the vicar's wife. But when Miss Marple inquired lightly if she had seen anyone on the stairs Tuesday evening, Mrs. Redford hesitated before answering. "No." A pause, ever so slight. Jealousy, Miss Marple thought, sometimes makes people conceal what they've seen, particularly if it involves another woman receiving attention. She then contrived to speak with Mr. Trelawney again, this time asking whether the inn had received any unusual parcels in recent weeks. He stiffened, almost imperceptibly, before assuring her that they had not. Yet Mrs. Trelawney, when asked later in the kitchen, admitted a small crate had arrived addressed to Mrs. Collingford, a crate which the widow insisted on carrying upstairs herself. Mrs. Trelawney had thought it odd at the time, as it seemed surprisingly heavy for its size. The crate, the vase, the missing papers. Miss Marple's mind was forming a picture, though not yet a complete one. If the crate had contained something valuable or dangerous, it might explain Hargreaves' persistence, Mrs. Redford's interest, and the Trelawneys' nervousness. But what could it be that required such secrecy, yet left no visible trace in room 17 after Mrs. Collingford's death? That night, as she sat by the fire, she reviewed the strands of the maze. Greed, Hargreaves, and perhaps Mrs. Redford. Fear, the Trelawneys. Possibly revenge, if Mrs. Collingford had wronged someone in the past. Each person's story touched the truth without revealing it. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the hallway, where the closed door of room 17 remained undisturbed. The authorities had declared it an unfortunate heart attack, but Miss Marple knew that in cases where greed, fear, and secrecy mix, death is seldom entirely natural. The motives were tangled, but there was one certainty. Whatever had brought the silent widow to Brambleford had also brought danger with her. And someone in the inn, perhaps someone still sipping tea by the fire, knew exactly why. The next morning dawned clear, a pale light breaking over Brambleford, as though the rain had washed the village clean. The police had departed, their reports neatly filed, the scandal officially resolved. Life at the inn resumed its measured pace, or so it seemed. Miss Marple, however, was not deceived. Her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that evil seldom stays tidily in the past unless it has been properly buried. And here, in room 17, The past had begun to stir again. She sat in her accustomed chair in the lounge, knitting in hand, when a faint remark from Mrs. Redford caught her ear. The woman was describing her late husband's travels in a way she had not before, speaking of ports visited and unpleasant legal troubles in Gibraltar. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. Gibraltar. A name tugged at her memory, not from gossip, but from an old case she had read about in the newspaper some 15 years earlier. A case involving a smuggling ring, forged bills of lading, and a certain Harold Denholm who had disappeared before trial. Miss Marple looked over her glasses at Mrs. Redford, whose voice had grown just a shade too airy. Harold Denholm, the very name Sergeant Willis had announced as belonging to Mrs. Collingford's mysterious correspondent. Later that day, a walk to the village shop provided the excuse Miss Marple needed to stop at the post office again. Mrs. Pratt, as ever, had useful tidbits to share. "You mentioned Mr. Denholm yesterday," Miss Marple said quietly, as she accepted a packet of sewing needles. "I seem to remember some trouble in Gibraltar years ago." Mrs. Pratt nodded eagerly. "Oh, yes, dear. Smuggling of some kind. There was a Mrs. Denholm, too. Quite the beauty, but she vanished after her husband fled. Some said she took a new name. Others thought she drowned herself, though there was never a body. Miss Marple returned to the inn deep in thought. A vanished wife, a fugitive husband, a smuggling operation, and now a widow named Collingford corresponding with Denholm once again. That evening, her path crossed with Mr. Hargreaves in the hallway. His expression, usually so carefully neutral, slipped when she mentioned the name Denholm in passing. Just the faintest flicker of recognition, and then a swift mask of indifference. The pieces began to shift. Mrs. Redford's evasions, Hargreaves's interest in letters, the Trelawneys' nervousness about scandal, all of it felt less like isolated motives and more like threads from the same tapestry. In the quiet of her room, Miss Marple reviewed what she knew. Mrs. Collingford, once perhaps Mrs. Denholm, had been part of something in Gibraltar years ago. Mr. Denholm, still at large, was arranging payment on delivery for some item, possibly connected to that old smuggling business. The crate that had arrived at the inn might have contained it. And the others, Hargreaves, Mrs. Redford, perhaps even Mr. Trelawney, had reasons rooted in those old dealings to watch, to intercept, to silence. The crime was no longer about a single letter, or a missing vase, or a death in a quiet village inn. It was about unfinished business from years before, business that had followed the silent widow of room 17 until it caught up with her. Miss Marple's eyes lingered briefly on the closed door of room 17 as she passed it in the corridor. The past, she knew, has long shadows, and here those shadows were beginning to take shape. Miss Marple had always believed that people, like knitting patterns, reveal themselves if one knows where to look for the slipped stitch. But sometimes it requires a little nudge, an unconventional tug on the yarn to see which thread unravels first. That evening, the inn's lounge was warm with the scent of tea and the faint crackle of the fire. The guests, lulled into a false sense of calm by the police's solution, had relaxed their guard. It was the perfect time for a little experiment. Miss Marple, seemingly lost in her knitting, remarked casually to Mrs. Redford, "Such a pity about Mrs. Collingford's vase. So very old, you know. Pieces like that are often worth a small fortune, particularly to collectors in Gibraltar. Why, I once heard of a dealer who could identify a fragment by its glaze alone." She let the statement hang in the air. Mrs. Redford's needle hesitated for just a second before she laughed too brightly. "Oh, my dear Miss Marple, surely it was just a cheap ornament, nothing to interest anyone serious." Her voice was too quick, too eager to dismiss. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Perhaps. But sometimes a thing appears ordinary until one knows what to look for. I dare say the remaining pieces will tell their own story, should the police bother to have them examined." Across the room, Mr. Hargreaves lowered his newspaper just slightly, his eyes flicking toward the conversation. His jaw tightened before he resumed reading, but Miss Marple noticed the knuckles gripping the paper had whitened. Her next move was subtler still. At supper, she arranged to sit beside Mr. Trelawney. In her soft voice, she began to reminisce about an old case in which a guest house had been unwittingly used to store items of interest for an absent businessman. She spoke of the scandal when the truth came out, not the criminality, but the ruin to the inn's reputation. Mr. Trelawney's hand trembled faintly as he poured the tea. "One mustn't believe everything one hears, Miss Marple. Gossip can destroy a business faster than anything." His eyes darted toward his wife, who was carefully avoiding looking at him. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, indeed. Gossip can be so very destructive. Unless, of course, it turns out to be the truth." It was enough. That slight pause, the over-anxious denial. Both were exactly what she needed. Later that night, in the quiet hallway, Miss Marple deliberately dropped her ball of yarn outside Mr. Hargreaves' door, bending to retrieve it just as he stepped out. She looked up with her mild, apologetic expression. "Oh dear, so clumsy of me. I do hope I haven't interrupted any important business. I was only thinking how fortunate the constable was to have found that letter before anyone else had a chance to tidy things away." For the briefest instant, Mr. Hargreaves's mask slipped. There was a flash of calculation, then the smooth, practiced smile returned. "Quite so, Miss Marple. Fortunate indeed." Miss Marple carried her yarn back to her room, satisfied. It was not a confession, but the reaction was telling. People can guard their words, but it is far harder to guard their faces when they believe themselves safe. Her unconventional method had worked, not by catching anyone in a direct lie, but by watching how each reacted when the subject of the vase, the letter, and Gibraltar was dangled before them. The cracks were there now, hairline fractures in the facade. It was only a matter of time before one of them widened enough to reveal the truth beneath. The following morning began with a small commotion at the inn, quiet enough to avoid alarming the other guests, but sharp enough to draw Miss Marple's attention immediately. Mrs. Trelawney, pale and anxious, was whispering urgently to her husband just outside the lounge. Their voices dropped when Miss Marple passed, but she caught a few telling words. "Gone. Drawer. Nothing left." Moments later, Sergeant Willis arrived again, summoned by Mr. Trelawney. He listened gravely to the report that the remaining fragments of Mrs. Collingford's vase, the very ones Miss Marple had hinted might be examined, had vanished overnight from the locked cupboard where they had been stored for safekeeping. "A housekeeping mix-up, most likely," Willis said, though his tone was thin, unconvincing. "These things happen." But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her usual chair, knew better. Objects do not simply vanish from locked cupboards without assistance. And there was more. Along with the vase fragments, the blue-inked letter from Mr. Denholm had also disappeared from the police's evidence envelope. It was no mere mix-up. Someone was working carefully, methodically, to erase the very trail she had been following. That afternoon, the air in the inn shifted. Conversations grew hushed. Mrs. Redford avoided the lounge entirely, claiming a headache, while Mr. Hargreaves took an uncharacteristically long walk to the village. Even Mr. Trelawney seemed distracted, fumbling through the account book and failing to notice a paying guest's request for tea. Trust, Miss Marple reflected, was becoming a rare commodity in the Trelawney arms. It was now clear that someone, perhaps more than one person, was actively protecting secrets from the past, secrets valuable enough to risk tampering with police evidence. That evening, as the fire crackled in the lounge, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet observation to Sergeant Willis. "It's curious, isn't it, how the things that disappear are always the things least likely to be forgotten? A vase in fragments, a letter in blue ink. One would almost think the person removing them understands precisely which threads to cut before the tapestry can be examined. Willis frowned, clearly uneasy. "You think someone here is still involved, Miss Marple?" She looked down at her knitting, her voice mild. "My dear Sergeant, I've always found that when something vanishes, it is usually because someone wishes it not to be seen. The more interesting question is not what was taken, but why at this particular moment." Miss Marple had her own suspicion. The theft was not simply about hiding evidence, it was about buying time. Whoever had removed the vase and the letter believed that the danger of discovery was close enough to warrant such a risk. The stakes had shifted. The game was no longer about quietly observing the cracks in a calm facade. Now, the culprit was taking action, and in doing so, had shown just how desperate they had become. The next evening began in deceptive quiet. The rain had returned, tapping softly against the windows of the lounge while the guests lingered over tea. Miss Marple, knitting steadily, felt the air tighten. Not from the weather, but from the stillness of people trying too hard to appear unconcerned. It was just after supper that the calm cracked. Mrs. Trelawney's shrill voice cut through the hall, followed by hurried footsteps. "He's gone! Harold's gone! Mr. Hargreaves!" The guests gathered, their faces pale. The door to Mr. Hargreaves' room stood open, his suitcase missing, bed undisturbed. On the writing desk, a half-finished letter lay in his precise hand, but the last lines trailed into a violent scrawl. Sergeant Willis, summoned again in haste, searched the room but found no sign of forced entry. The back door to the inn, however, the one leading toward the footpath by the river, stood ajar, wet footprints on the stone. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the doorway, noted the details others overlooked. The footprints were uneven, one deeper than the other, as if made by someone being half carried or dragged. Before anyone could speculate further, a cry came from outside. One of the villagers had spotted something by the reeds. Moments later, the group gathered on the riverbank as Willis and two others pulled an overcoat from the water, the very one Mr. Hargreaves had worn earlier that day. The pockets were weighted with stones. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Suicide, some whispered. Others, murder. But Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Mr. Hargreaves was a careful man, not one to leave a suitcase behind if intending to vanish permanently. And the stones in his coat, too deliberate, too staged. Back inside, the atmosphere shifted sharply. Fear had replaced polite suspicion. If Mr. Hargreaves had met with foul play, then someone in the inn had taken dangerous steps to silence him. For Miss Marple, the danger was now doubled. Whoever had removed the evidence was willing to remove witnesses as well, and if they suspected she was closer to the truth than she appeared. That evening, in the quiet of her room, she double-checked the lock on her door. Her knitting lay untouched on the table. The case was no longer about uncovering the truth at leisure. It was about staying one step ahead of someone willing to kill again. The game had changed, and Miss Marple knew she had very little time left to stop it. Would you like me to move directly into The Web Tightens, 1,000 to 1,200 words, where this disappearance pushes Miss Marple to set the final trap? The pattern emerges. 1,000 to 1,200 words. Despite the chaos, a pattern starts to take shape. A small, seemingly insignificant detail, an offhand comment, a misplaced object, or an unusual habit, suddenly makes sense. The detective realizes that the key to the case has been in plain sight all along. The inn was unsettled after Hargreaves' disappearance. Guests whispered over breakfast, voices pitched low, eyes darting toward the empty chair in the corner. Sergeant Willis was still combing the riverside, but no body had been recovered. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone. Had Hargreaves drowned, or had he vanished deliberately? Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her quiet work. She had learned over many years that in moments of chaos, truth often floats to the surface, if one listens closely enough. That morning, as Mrs. Redford came into the lounge, she complained in her usual brisk manner about the terrible damp ruining her gloves. She tossed them onto the table, muttering about having left them near the fire the night before. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch, left near the fire. She remembered distinctly seeing Mrs. Redford's gloves on the hall table, not in the lounge, and the gloves themselves, polished leather with a faint smudge of something pale along the seams. Her eyes drifted toward the grate. A faint residue of ash dusted the hearth, unusual for a night when the fire had been allowed to burn low. Ash from wood was expected, but this had the slightly gritty texture of charred paper or porcelain. Porcelain. The missing vase fragments had been stored in a cupboard off the hall. The cupboard that, as Mrs. Trelawney had told Willis, had been left unlocked just for a moment while she fetched linens. And Mrs. Redford had passed that way carrying her gloves. A memory tugged at Miss Marple. Something from much earlier. The day she had first spoken of the vase's possible value to a collector, Mrs. Redford's laughter had been a little too quick, a little too sharp, almost as though she was reassuring herself as much as anyone else. And then there was the other small matter, the Denholm letter. Mrs. Redford had claimed to have no knowledge of Gibraltar, but her offhand correction of the pronunciation of a local street name, casemates, spoken with a precise familiarity, had been out of place for someone who had never traveled. A pattern was beginning to take shape, delicate but undeniable. The missing vase, the vanished letter, Hargreaves' disappearance, they all radiated outward from the same nexus. Mrs. Redford's presence threaded through each, as lightly and invisibly as her gloves now lay on the table. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her needles clicked a little faster. The key to the case had never been hidden in an elaborate scheme. It had been in plain sight, in the nervous habits and careful words of a woman determined to erase traces of the past. The pattern was clear. Now it was a matter of tightening the web before its most dangerous occupant slipped free. The next day dawned gray and unsettled, a fitting reflection of the atmosphere inside the Trelawney Arms. Sergeant Willis lingered near the bar, waiting for further instructions from his superior, while the guests moved about with the nervous energy of people avoiding one another. Miss Marple, however, seemed content with her knitting in the lounge. She had been thinking very carefully about Mrs. Redford, her evasions, her quick denials, the faint cracks in her composure. The woman's behavior pointed to a motive, but not the ordinary kind. It wasn't greed alone, nor the fear of mere exposure. In the quiet mid-morning lull, Miss Marple began her gentle work. She invited Mrs. Redford for tea in the small side parlor, away from the others. Mrs. Redford hesitated, always a telling sign, before agreeing. As the tea was poured, Miss Marple began in her mild voice. "It is such a curious thing, Mrs. Redford, how objects carry stories. A vase, for instance. In the right hands, it might be worth far more sentimentally than financially, especially if it once belonged to someone we knew, long ago." Mrs. Redford's spoon clinked sharply against her cup. "I don't see what you mean." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Oh, but I think you do. I think the vase was more than a decorative piece to you, just as the letter from Mr. Denholm was more than correspondence. It wasn't about money. It was about silencing the past, about ensuring that certain names, certain places, never came to light." Mrs. Redford's color drained slightly. Miss Marple leaned forward, voice gentle but firm. "You were once in Gibraltar, weren't you, Mrs. Redford, before you came to England? I believe you knew Mr. Hargreaves there, under rather different circumstances, and Mrs. Collingford as well. That vase wasn't merely valuable. It was a token, a reminder of a business that ended in tragedy, a business you could not afford to have uncovered here." The room seemed to shrink. Mrs. Redford's hands, usually so brisk and sure, trembled slightly against her teacup. Miss Marple continued softly. You weren't protecting wealth, my dear. You were protecting your identity. The past has a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times, and when Mrs. Collingford arrived with that vase and Mr. Denholm's letter, it threatened to expose everything. You had remade yourself here, hadn't you? The respectable widow, far from the scandal of Gibraltar. Mrs. Redford's voice was barely audible. You don't understand. I think I do, Miss Marple said quietly. The fear of losing one's hard-won respectability can drive a person to desperate measures. It wasn't revenge or even greed. It was survival, an unwillingness to see the life you built unravel. Mrs. Redford looked away, her composure cracking at last. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't. Her words faltered into silence. Miss Marple's knitting lay still in her lap. The motive was no longer a mystery. It was as old as human nature itself, the length to which someone will go to bury a past that refuses to stay buried. The evening air at the Trelawney Arms felt almost unnaturally still, as though the old walls themselves were holding their breath. Miss Marple had chosen her moment carefully. She'd spent the day in quiet observation, allowing Mrs. Redford just enough space to believe she might have weathered the storm. But now the web was ready to draw tight. A fire crackled in the lounge, casting long shadows. The remaining guests had been subtly encouraged to gather. Miss Marple had her ways, after all. Sergeant Willis lingered nearby, ready to act, though still unsure of exactly what the elderly lady intended. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, her knitting neatly in her lap. Her voice, when she began to speak, was mild, conversational. It's been such a dreadful few days, hasn't it? Yet one must always remember that truth, however delayed, has a habit of revealing itself. Sometimes in the smallest of ways, like a glove left out of place, or a vase that should never have been here at all. Mrs. Redford stiffened. Miss Marple's eyes moved around the room, touching each person lightly. Mrs. Collingford's death, Mr. Hargreaves's disappearance, and the stolen evidence, they were not separate events. They were all threads in a single tapestry, woven long ago in Gibraltar, a place where certain acquaintances crossed paths under names they might rather forget. Mrs. Redford's hands were folded too tightly in her lap. Miss Marple's tone softened. You see, the vase was not merely valuable. It was incriminating. A gift from an associate whose dealings you could not afford to see unearthed. Mrs. Collingford's arrival with that vase was no accident, and when she began to make discreet inquiries, Mrs. Redford's voice broke the silence, sharp and defensive. This is absurd. You're accusing me without proof. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. On the contrary, my dear, the proof has been here all along. You destroyed the vase fragments, rather hastily, I might add, in the lounge fire. You took the Denholm letter, believing it gone forever. And poor Mr. Hargreaves, who recognized you and threatened to speak, was silenced before he could reach the police. Your gloves, Mrs. Redford, still bear the faint trace of the porcelain dust. The room was very still. Willis stepped forward, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. Her voice remained calm, unhurried. You see, Mrs. Redford, the cleverest lies fail not because of what they conceal, but because of what they cannot change. You erased the physical traces, but you could not erase the memory of those who saw you years ago. The pattern was always there. Mrs. Redford's face went pale, her composure cracking at last. I had no choice, she whispered, her voice trembling. You don't know what it's like to build a life from nothing, to live every day waiting for the past to catch you. I wasn't going to let it take me again. Her eyes darted toward the door, but Willis was already there. Miss Marple rose slowly, setting her knitting aside. Running will not change what has been done, Mrs. Redford. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, just as the stones in Mr. Hargreaves' coat will not keep him hidden forever. The last of Mrs. Redford's resistance seemed to drain away. Shoulders slumped, she looked at Miss Marple with something like weary defeat. You're very dangerous for someone so small, she murmured. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I have always found, my dear, that people underestimate the quiet ones. It is quite useful. As Willis led Mrs. Redford away, the tension in the lounge broke like a taut string. The other guests looked at Miss Marple with awe and relief, though she only resumed her seat in her knitting, as though the evening had been no more than an ordinary diversion. The pieces were in place. The web had closed. Would you like me to move directly into The Truth Unveiled, 1,000 to 1,200 words, where all remaining mysteries are explained and the full story comes to light? The last-minute twist, 1,000 to 1,200 words. Just when everything seems resolved, a final revelation shakes things up. Perhaps the real mastermind was someone unexpected, or the case isn't as open and shut as it appeared. The detective's genius is tested one last time. The Trelawney arms had begun to relax. Mrs. Redford, now firmly in Sergeant Willis's custody, was to be taken into town at first light. The guests allowed themselves a touch of relieved laughter over supper, though it was brittle around the edges. The storm had passed, or so they thought. Miss Marple, however, did not share their ease. As she sat quietly knitting, a faint unease threaded through her thoughts. Something was too tidy, too neatly tied off. Mrs. Redford's guilt was undeniable, yet certain details lingered like a shadow that refused to dissolve. The first sign came in the form of a folded note slipped under her door after dusk. The handwriting was small and precise. She's not the only one. Be careful who you trust. Miss Marple read it twice, then placed it neatly on the table. It was confirmation of her unease. There had been another hand in this business. Her mind sifted through the evidence once more. The stolen vase fragments, the Denholm letter, the stones in Hargreaves' coat. Mrs. Redford had acted with desperation, yes, but there had been planning here as well, planning beyond her panicked attempts to erase her past. It was then that Miss Marple recalled Mr. Graves, the quiet bookkeeper who had been at the inn since before Mrs. Collingford's arrival. He had always been at hand when Sergeant Willis made a discovery, always helpful in ways that subtly directed suspicion. And most curiously, he had been the one to suggest Hargreaves might have fled by river before any sign of the coat had been found. The realization formed like a slow dawn. Mrs. Redford's crimes were real, but she had not been the one moving the pieces on the board. Someone else had taken advantage of her panic, nudging events toward a convenient outcome. Miss Marple descended quietly to the lounge where Mr. Graves was finishing his solitary port. Her voice, when she spoke, was light but edged with steel. Such a relief, isn't it, when matters resolve so neatly? Though, of course, there's always the danger of things being a little too neat. A tidy conclusion can be such a useful cover for someone who prefers not to be noticed. Graves looked up sharply. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, Miss Marple replied, settling opposite him. Mrs. Redford was convenient, but not clever enough to manage every detail. The river, for instance. How fortunate you were to suggest the search just there, so that Mr. Hargreaves' coat would be found. And the vase fragments, so quick to remark on the fire's unusual ash before anyone else noticed. You've been at the scene of every turning point in this case, Mr. Graves. His fingers tightened on the glass. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. You had a stake in Mrs. Redford's past, didn't you? Her silence kept certain other names buried. Names you very much preferred remained forgotten. By guiding suspicion onto her, you've preserved your own position, but alas. Her eyes twinkled faintly. One must never assume a little old lady fails to see the whole pattern. For a moment, Graves' expression was a mask. Then, with a tight smile, he set down his glass. I suppose I should admire you, Miss Marple. Not many would see it, but you'll forgive me if I don't stay for applause. He rose abruptly, but Sergeant Willis, summoned by a discreet note Miss Marple had sent earlier, stepped from the doorway. Graves froze, his quiet veneer cracking just enough to reveal the truth beneath. As Willis led him away, the room felt colder. Mrs. Redford had been desperate, but Graves had been calculating. 2 layers of deception hidden within the same crime. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though the yarn rested quietly in her lap. The case was over at last. Properly over, but the reminder lingered. Even the neatest endings may conceal one last thread waiting to be pulled. Morning light filtered weakly through the leaded windows of the Trelawney Arms, painting the lounge in shades of pale gold and shadow. The storm had passed, but the air still held that charged stillness that follows a night of revelation. The guests gathered once more, a mixture of curiosity and unease hanging in the room. They needed to hear the whole story. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, her knitting in her lap but untouched. Her voice, when she began, was gentle but steady, each word measured as though she were placing a final stitch in a long, intricate pattern. Mrs. Redford's guilt was plain enough, she said. Her fear of her past drove her to desperation when Mrs. Collingford arrived with the vase and the letter. But what many of you did not see, what I admit I suspected only late in the day, was that she was not acting alone. Not in the sense of cooperation, but rather in the sense of orchestration. The room murmured. Mr. Graves, Miss Marple continued, was a man who preferred to operate from the shadows. His connection to Gibraltar was less obvious, but no less significant. He knew the history Mrs. Redford wished to keep buried. By quietly feeding Sergeant Willis certain ideas, the search along the river, the ash in the fire, he ensured suspicion would settle on her, clearing his own name and protecting others still connected to those events. She glanced at the guests, her eyes calm. The Denholm letter was not just a threat to Mrs. Redford. It was a threat to Graves as well. Had it been read, certain financial records, hidden in the guise of personal correspondence, would have pointed directly to him. His removal of that evidence and his manipulation of events was designed to appear as nothing more than a helpful bystander's insight. Mrs. Collingford's death, she explained, had been Mrs. Redford's act, rash, born of fear, but the subsequent disappearance of Hargreaves, the careful placement of clues, and the attempt to destroy all remaining links to Gibraltar bore Graves' calculated hand. As for justice, Miss Marple said, her voice softening, Mrs. Redford will stand trial. Her desperation will count for little before the law, though perhaps the court will see her life for what it truly was, a long battle against a past that would not leave her in peace. Mr. Graves. She hesitated just a fraction. Well, his connections are formidable. It remains to be seen whether justice will keep hold of him. Men like Graves are adept at slipping through the cracks, though I have given Sergeant Willis every detail that might close them. A silence fell over the room, thick and uneasy. The guests wanted certainty, but Miss Marple knew better than to promise it. She picked up her knitting again, her needles moving softly. What matters, she said, almost as if to herself, is that truth is never so easily hidden as some believe. Even in the quietest places, there are eyes that see and ears that listen. A small detail, the placement of a vase, the careless mention of a river, can unravel the grandest of schemes. Her work clicked softly in the silence. The others sat in thoughtful stillness, knowing they had witnessed a resolution of sorts, though not a perfectly tidy one. Justice had been served, perhaps, or perhaps it had only been delayed. And as the morning wore on, Miss Marple returned to her quiet knitting, her sharp mind already at rest, but never at ease. The Trelawney Arms had returned to its usual rhythm, or so it seemed. Guests no longer spoke in hushed tones over breakfast. The staff moved briskly, no longer glancing nervously toward the staircase. The scandal was over, at least for them. Miss Marple, however, knew that true endings were rare things. She stood by the inn's door that crisp morning, her small travel case in hand, waiting for the modest car that would take her to the station. Sergeant Willis had offered a formal farewell, thanking her in his earnest, slightly awkward way. Mrs. Redford was in custody. Graves was under watch, though whether the law would hold him remained uncertain. And yet something tugged faintly at her thoughts. The note slipped under her door days earlier had never been traced. Graves had denied sending it, and Mrs. Redford was in no position to write anonymous warnings. Someone else had known more than they should. Miss Marple could not decide whether that knowledge had been meant to help or to distract. As she stepped outside, the morning air was sharp, the lane quiet. She paused, glancing back at the inn. One of the upstairs curtains moved, just a fraction, and she caught the briefest glimpse of a figure stepping away, too far, too shadowed to identify. Her driver, a young man with sandy hair, touched his cap. "Ready, ma'am?" "Yes, thank you," Miss Marple replied, settling into the seat. But her gaze lingered on the inn's windows until the car rolled out of sight. The journey toward the station was peaceful enough. Fields rolling by, the countryside still wet from the storm. Miss Marple's knitting sat in her lap, though her hands remained still. She thought again of that curtain, of the note, of the one or two details that still rested uneasily in her mind. The driver, glancing in the mirror, attempted conversation. Terrible business back there. Glad it's all wrapped up now, eh? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Oh, my dear. Things are rarely wrapped up as neatly as we like to think. Sometimes the loose threads are merely tucked away, waiting for someone to notice. He laughed politely, perhaps unsure if she was joking. At the station, as she stepped onto the platform, a porter approached with her case. In the process, he handed her a small envelope that had arrived on the early post. No return address, just her name in careful handwriting. She waited until she was seated on the train, steam hissing softly outside, before she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, on which were written only 6 words. "Room 17 is never truly empty." Miss Marple read it twice, then tucked it neatly into her knitting bag. Her lips curved in the faintest of smiles, not of amusement, but of recognition. As the train pulled away, the countryside sliding past, she settled into her seat. The case of the silent widow of room 17 was finished, at least for now. But in the quiet depths of her mind, she knew the story was not quite over. There were still questions unasked, answers lurking like shadows in the corners of memory. Miss Marple began to knit, the steady rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. There would be another time, another place, when one of those loose threads would tug again. And when it did, she would be ready. For in her experience, a mystery never truly ends. It merely waits.